Thank you for the introduction. And hello, everyone. Hello. Hello. Good, good. Just want to make sure you're awake now. Not you. Thank you. I'd like to tell you about the world that I was born into. A dangerous world that I survived only because of major luck. And a world that I hope none of you ever have to experience. The place, Warsaw. The time, September 1939. Hitler's Nazi armies invade Poland and start World War II. With hundreds of airplanes, you gotta find the button. Thank you. With hundreds of airplanes, thousands of tanks, and 1 million troops. And 1 million troops, the Nazi army sweeps across Poland in 1 month. They conquer it, and then they hold a victory parade on the streets of Warsaw. And even Hitler himself comes to view it. You probably recognize the leather coat and the outstretched arm. I don't remember this. I was only 1 year old when this happened, so I don't remember this year. But I remember most things since I was about 3 years old. And at that time, when this happened, I lived in Warsaw, in an area that became the ghetto. And I had a family of 12 people. Parents, 2 sets of grandparents, aunts, uncles, no brothers or sisters. And that turned out to be lucky for me. And within 3 years, out of those 12 people, only 2 people were alive, my mother and I. The other 10 were all murdered by the Nazis. Why? Because they were Jewish. As you probably know, the stated goal of the Nazi Party was to exterminate everybody that they considered undesirable. Jews were on top of that list, but there were also others, gypsies, gays, invalids, socialists. But Jews were the largest group. And at that time, in Poland, there were about 3,300,000 Jews. Within 5 years, 90% of them, 9 out of every 10, were murdered, individually or in gas chambers. The reason, of course, is anti-Semitism. And anti-Semitism, this is like all the other antis. It doesn't matter whether it's anti-Semitism, anti-Christian, anti-Muslim, anti-gay or anti-straight, anti-black, anti-white, anti-socialist. These are all hatreds. Not because someone has done anything to you, but because they're different. And antis are nothing but negative and only lead to destruction. You have to be for something in this world to do any good, not against something. Try to keep that in mind when you find yourself hating something more than being for something. Altogether, what became known as the Holocaust was the murder of the 6 million Jews in 5 years. Now, what's 6 million? That's a huge number. How do you get a feeling for what's 6 million? Well, consider that 6 million in 5 years is 1,200,000 every year, or 100,000 every month. And these are all civilians, men, women, and children. No battle casualties. 100,000 killed every month. If you consider that, let's say Warsaw has 1,700,000 population right now, that means that the Nazis killed as many Jews as 3.5 Warsaws during the 5 years of the war. 3.5 cities the size of Warsaw during the 5 years of the war. That is just unbelievable. I mean, nothing in history has ever been even approaching this. Even the Mongol hordes did nothing like that. Then you can ask yourself, okay, so the immorality of it, the horror of it is not comprehensible. But how could they do it? How do you mechanically murder 100,000 people every month and you do this for 5 years running? It seems impossible. But the Nazis were very efficient. They set up what became known as the ghettos. In each of the countries that they conquered, they chose 1 or 2 or 3 major cities. And in those cities, they chose an area. And they built a wall around it. It was an area where a lot of Jews were already living. They put a wall around it, a brick wall with barbed wire on top, with gates guarded by guards, with machine guns and dogs. And if anybody within this walled-in area wasn't Jewish, they would move them out. And then they swept the rest of the city. And I'll only be talking about Warsaw because that's where I was born and that's what I remember. So they swept the rest of the city around this walled-in area, and they took all the Jews from the rest of the city, and they swept the rest of the countryside in the neighborhood of Warsaw, smaller cities, towns, villages, and they took any Jews that were living in this whole area, and then they pushed everybody into the ghetto. And think of this. Suppose that there is an area, whatever city you come from, think of maybe an area of 4, 5, 6 blocks, 10 blocks, doesn't matter. And let's assume that there's 100,000 people living in that area, in your city. What happens if you take another 400,000 or 500,000 people and you shove them into that area where there's already 100,000 people living in it, and there's only enough room and roof and apartments and houses for the 100,000? What happens to this other 400,000 or 500,000 people? Where do they live? Well, if they were lucky, if they knew someone who lived there, friends or relatives, they would move in with them. And I remember when I was about 3 years old, suddenly there were about a dozen people living in this apartment, where at that time there was only my mother, my grandmother, and I. The men, like my grandfather and my father, they had already been gone, and we didn't know this, but at that time they were already dead. And I remember these strangers who were living all of a sudden in this apartment with us. They were everywhere. They were sleeping on the couches, sleeping on the floor, in the kitchen, in the hallway. And I remember asking my mother, who are they? What are they doing here? And my mother said, well, they're friends. They'll be with us for a little while. And indeed, they were with us for only a little while, because as soon as the ghettos were packed, the Nazis began to move everybody out of the ghetto and sending them to concentration camps, and most of them to the gas chambers. I remember specifically how it happened in the block where I was living. And rather than telling you about it, I will read to you from a book that I wrote 4 years ago, after being silent about the Holocaust for about 60-some years. The book is called Neither Yesterdays Nor Tomorrows. And if we have time, I'll tell you that it was inspired by a small Tennessee school, middle school. I've never been there. I don't know anybody from there. But they inspired me to write this book after being silent for 60-some years. The chapter is called Umschlagplatz, which in German means collection point or shipping point. Now, I do not speak German. I never did. But the word Umschlagplatz, I first heard it when I was 4 years old. I'm 75 now, so I remember that word for 71 years. Umschlagplatz. Suddenly there was loud shouting coming from the courtyard. Then the entire apartment complex was filled with ear-splitting noise. Shouts, screams, doors banging everywhere, and heavy, running footsteps. My grandmother ran into the room holding my coat, grabbed my hand, and led me to the staircase, which was already filled with people, all going downstairs. When we reached the courtyard, it was already full of people crowded together in groups, with soldiers in dark green uniforms, shouting orders and walking between the groups. My grandmother held my hand very tightly as we were pushed back and forth by the crowd, till finally we were standing at the edge of one of the groups, facing a large arched entry gate that led from the street into our courtyard. It seemed we stood there a long, long time, and I recall being glad that my grandmother put my coat on me because I was getting cold. And I remember seeing some groups being led by soldiers out of the courtyard through that big gate. Just like that, exactly like that. The gate in the back, and the soldiers guarding the civilians who are being filed out through that gate. Then suddenly, I saw my mother running through the gate, holding a piece of paper in her hand, showing the paper to some soldiers, talking with them, and finally coming to us and leading us out of the courtyard. It was only years later, after the war, did I understand what happened. The Nazis were emptying out the Warsaw Ghetto, one apartment block at a time, and shipping the residents to concentration camps. My mother, who was working at a factory in the ghetto, which the Nazi authorities authorized the American Jewish Joint Distribution Committee to manage and make uniforms for the Nazi army, she somehow learned that our apartment block was being emptied out that day. And she got from the factory director an official document allowing her to keep her family in place. With this document, in effect, a temporary permit to continue living. Think about that, a temporary permit to continue living. She managed to convince the Nazi officer commanding that day's sweep to let us go. Had she arrived a few minutes later, it would have been too late. And my fate would probably have been like that little boy, because he probably lived another week or two after that photo was taken. Because from here, all of these people were taken to the freight yards, put on freight trains, and sent to concentration camps. And all children, most women, and all the weaker or older men would be sent directly to the gas chambers. So a few minutes later, I wouldn't be here with you right now. Luck.